Yeah, I was
Right.
about to say it.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Empower Debate topic analysis for the January PF topic. It is on the topic resolved the African Union should grant diplomatic recognition to the Republic of Somaliland as an independent state. All right. So the quick roadmap for today is first we're going to go over the background on Somaliland. Then we're going to go over some definitions and actors in the region. Then we're going to go on some pros and con arguments, and then we're going to do a quick Q&A session.
Yeah, so first to introduce ourselves, I'm Maeve. I debate for St. Luke's. Just some quick background about like who's presenting today. I've been debating since eighth grade. I'm a junior. I have five cumulative bids to the TOC. I've qualified to nationals, and I've also debated Blake and the Blake round robin on this topic. So pretty fun. And then Salman and Nirmal, do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Salman. I'm Maeve's partner. I also debate for St. Luke's. So yeah, it's also been debating since eighth grade. We did Blake and the round robin on this tournament. So
All right, my name's Nirmal. I've been debating since freshman year. So it's my second year doing debate. I'm a sophomore from Theodore Roosevelt. I also bid at Blake, but I didn't do the round robin though.
Hi, I'm just here. I'm Steven. I'm one of the co-founders of Empower Debate, and I debated for Brooklyn Tech. All
Awesome.
right, so quickly
Yeah, so in
starting
the
over
beginning.
some background.
Okay, cool. I could take this one. So essentially, Somaliland is located in the Horn of Africa, which, if you don't know, it is on the easternmost side of Africa and it's also very northern. And the reason the Horn of Africa is such an important region is because it's on the Red Sea, which makes it really important for a lot of global trade. When you think about it, you have countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia that are really prominent in this sea and are trading. And so you have a lot of vying for power. So you'll see the United States, China, India, Russia all involved in this region too. It is very, very important. But Somaliland, as I think everyone's going to learn on this topic, is not really seen as an official state. What it is it's a de facto state, meaning that it has all of the qualities of being a state, but it does not have recognition or legitimacy to make it that. And so right now, what the situation was there was Somalia, which was a larger group, but in 1961, the Asat clan, who are the primary group in Somaliland, they make up 80% of the population. They split from Somalia and they declared their independence. And so that happened, and now Somaliland functions kind of separately from Somalia, but they're still legally tied to Somalia. And so that's why they're a de facto state, because even though they do function on their own, they have their own economy, which is notably stronger than Somalia's. They have their own culture. They are still tied to Somalia legally, which is why recognition is so important because it gives them that kind of independence and sovereignty to say, hey, this is what I'm going to do. And so, yeah, just some more background. Like I said, it was a part of the Horn of Africa. It was originally a colonized state with Somaliland today being colonized by the British, while Somalia was colonized by the Italian. And so, yeah, it is a very post-colonial area given it's in Africa and just the Horn of Africa generally, where there was a ton of colonization in the day. And so it used to be a British, well, right there you can see. But, and then, yeah. Mhm. Does anyone have any background to add? Salman Nirmal? Any corrections, background?
no, I think you got
One
it.
thing I will add, however, is that one of the main reasons why Somaliland decided to I guess split from Somalia when they were I guess the same country was because this leader of Somalia, I think his name was Bar, he launched a genocide on the Isaaq clan and the people within Somaliland, which prompted their succession. So there's cultural claims to recognition as well.
Yeah. Also, quick correction. I said 1961. I meant that they became independent in 1961 and then Somaliland seceded in 1991 and declared independence. That's a just brief. And
Yeah,
so,
okay.
oh,
I
Salman,
can I can take the next
you
background
got
slide.
it.
Okay, cool. So this slide is mainly covering differences between Somaliland and Somalia. What you'll often hear Somalia referred to it's as as it's called a lot of times a failed state. this is because Somalia has like huge corruption issues and has is essentially like overrun with terrorist groups like Al Shabaab, and so it has a very weak economy and is super unstable. This is in contrast to Somaliland, which is like pretty is doing like pretty well and has like a relatively stable government and economy, especially for the region. And so Somaliland has a relatively stable democracy and has a GDP that's like around $2 billion and is like been seen to be growing over time. Um, yeah, and so the Somaliland has also been like vying for its independence and international recognition since 1991 when it officially like declared itself as a separate state. And so then I think like the rest of the sides will go on to say like which other countries and like why it should/should not be recognized.
All right, so just going over some definitions first on the African Union, which is like the actor in the resolution. So the African Union is like a group that consists of 55 countries in Africa, and it first was like I guess started in 2002. And the African Union is primarily like a organization that's like meant to handle like mediation efforts, as well as like foster cooperation between like the countries on the continent. And it also is meant to have like economic cohesion and like cooperation between like all the countries on the continent as well. So as you'll see, like the AU does not recognize Somaliland as an independent state, and instead it recognizes Somaliland as like a different, I guess, like functioning territory as part of Somalia. Um, which is why like Somaliland is like seeking like recognition from the EU and international actors. There is a couple of evidence out there that states that like the AU has to be like one of the first ones to recognize Somaliland, or like a country within the AU has to be the first ones to recognize Somaliland as an independent country, because there are like countries that like naturally are afraid to like be the first ones to accept another country. Um, the African Union also does have like its own peacekeeping forces, like the United Nations. So in the past, the AU has deployed its peacekeeping forces like in conflicts across the continent, for example, like in the Congo conflict. And there's also like plenty of states like literature that like states that once the AU recognizes Somaliland, other countries will too. The most common one used at Blake, that I'm aware of was the Schwartz evidence,
Yeah,
but I'm
there's
not too sure.
also, I would recommend the Ferragamo evidence. It's from this year. It's on my wiki if anyone wants it. But also, one quick thing to note about the African Union is that one of the principles that they're founded on is like maintaining current colonial boundaries, which is a little weird, but it's become a big argument on this topic to say that if Somaliland was recognized, that would go inherently against what the AU stands for, which is recognizing boundaries and not changing them. And so kind of a big argument on this topic has become AU instability, where people will say, if we recognize Somaliland, which is not technically an independent state and this border never existed, then that kind of like tears apart the AU, which you can make arguments for or against. Okay, I think we can get the next slide. Okay, so the next definition is diplomatic recognition, and to grant diplomatic recognition would essentially be recognizing a state and accepting the state as a part of the international community. And in the context of the African Union, that kind of just means telling them, hey, you can be a part of the African Union, letting them have like diplomats at the table. And I feel like there hasn't been much discourse over what it means to like grant diplomatic recognition and whether that means like, oh, we're going to support them with diplomats or like we're just going to let them speak. There's not much clarity. And so you could make an argument that granting diplomatic recognition is just like recognizing one diplomat, saying like, hey, this one guy from Somaliland can come and talk to the AU. But I don't think anyone's really doing that. But it just kind of means that like Somaliland would be a part of the African Union.
I would like to add real quickly that I'm pretty sure it was Blake LB.
Oh yeah.
In like round two or round three, they read like this sh like theory show saying that their opponents like weren't, I guess, like being topical or like related to the resolution because their arguments um weren't dependent on diplomatic recognition. So if you were like wanting to run some sort of like definition debate, I would like recommend looking at their disclosure page for a start.
Cool, yeah, I can take this one. So an independent state is a country with recognized territorial control. Um, and the that territory is controlled by that government. So it's like pretty self-explanatory. Um, yeah, so in the case of Somaliland, it would just be their military and their government would have control over the area. And like Somaliland's boundary right now is like, or where it would be is not very disputed. Everyone kind of knows where the boundaries of Somaliland is, and so yeah, independent state, pretty self-explanatory. Oh, I think we skipped one.
Okay, cool. So these are the arguments in the affirmation, so arguments supporting the fact that it should be recognized. So the first one is aid. Yeah, so I can take this one. So essentially, this is one of the arguments that's being read almost every round on the affirmative I've found, because it's just kind of one of the more true arguments, which is that there are certain like organizations, and if anyone wants to give like a specific example, I think it's like, what is it? I'm
I
forgetting on the name.
IMF is the one that people usually.
Oh, IMF, yeah. Don't mind that, guys. But essentially, Somaliland isn't able to access any funds, which would be probably very good for it because right now it doesn't have aid. But Somaliland is hit with a lot of natural disasters. There's a lot of internal conflict between like Puntland, which we'll get into a little later, and also just Somalia. Well, not really right now, but not the point. Essentially, it's just Somaliland can't receive aid from the IMF right now and can't get loans for like infrastructure projects because they're not a country. And then the link on this argument is that affirming and recognizing the state will allow more international aid groups to help people in Somaliland, which is true because then people will be able to kind of give aid through the IMF and also give government loans, which is very helpful. And so the impact, there are a lot of different impacts being read on this, but generally it's more lives saved with aid. I know that we read a version that was specific to like climate and climate infrastructure, but there's also like a food aid argument. And there's so many ways in which international aid could help people in Somaliland that this one's kind of a little broader, I would say. Does anyone have anything to add?
No,
No. Okay, cool. We'll go to the next slide.
I think there was one before. Yeah, international loans. Okay, so this one is kind of what Maeve was talking about earlier. This is just a little bit more specific. I think she brought up this example of like the IMF and the World Bank. So even though Somaliland is a de facto state and functions separately, because it doesn't have diplomatic recognition, it can't access international funds like the IMF and World Bank. So the link is pretty simple that just by allowing Somaliland onto the international stage would give it access to these funds like May was saying, there's a bunch of these different funds. Like one specifically that I remember recently is this one for like climate resilient infrastructure, which our case at Lake talked about. Um Actually, I don't think we were at Lake. But so yeah, so there's a bunch of funds that Somaliland would gain access to, and that would help like economic growth or like climate resistance or like food insecurity, and all those problems would be solved with international aid.
All right, another common argument that's like being run on the AF is like FDI, which like stands for foreign direct investment. So the uniqueness is that like Somaliland is like a poor country. It's like I'm pretty sure it's like the 17th poorest in the world on rankings. And because of that, like investors are hesitant to invest because of a lack of international recognition. Like it's kind of intuitive because if you're like an investor, you're going to be like less comfortable or like confident investing in like a country that isn't recognized because of there's like uncertainty tied with it. And then the link for this argument is that like once you affirm and like recognize Somaliland, that leads to like international recognition, which spurs like more like FDI going to Somaliland from like all these investors from across the world. And a warrant for that is because like Somaliland is like located on like the Red Sea, which like Maeve talked about earlier, which is like critical for like trade. And there's like this port called Berbera, which is like a really like strategic port on the Red Sea that has a lot of interest from investors. And then the internal link is that like FDI decreases poverty and increases peace in the Horn of Africa. And then the impact is that as a result of economic growth that stems from this increase in FDI, there'll be less poverty and less death.
Okay, cool. Okay, the next argument is piracy.
Oh,
Um,
real quickly, there's a question
oh
in the
yeah.
chat. So, it's that okay, the I guess the link between diplomatic recognition and like viability with like IMF and World Bank is that because Somaliland isn't a recognized country, they're like not eligible for like loans from like international organizations like the IMF and World Bank. So once they get that recognition, they'll be able to like access these loans from these multinational organizations. Does that make sense? Okay. Maybe I think you're good.
Okay, cool. So the next argument's piracy, which sounds a little silly, but it is an issue. And so recently, piracy has been on the rise in the Red Sea. And so there have been increased reports of like pirates who I'm honestly a little unsure of what the pirates are like doing directly. I think it's more just like theft and just general
Yeah,
like,
yeah, I think it's trade. I
yeah,
think it's mainly trade. It's like they're threatening trade
yeah.
ships.
And so there's a rise in piracy. And Somaliland does have the means to deter piracy, which they historically have, because prior to like really recently, piracy was really, really low. And however, with the rise in piracy, there's a need for additional resources to effectively fight piracy. And I think this one's pretty intuitive. Like if they get international aid and the US helps them fight piracy, which a lot of people are saying like it would, it's just like they would be able to deter it with more resources and have like more police forces to combat this and better like security measures. But the thing about this argument is that people are reading really large impact scenarios and so everyone will say, like, oh, if you shut down all global trade in the Red Sea, that's going to spill over, and then China's economy is going to crash, and then everyone's economy is going to crash. It's going to cause like nuke war. It's going to be crazy. I don't think that's really true. I think we've seen so many trade blockages that there's a lot of intuitive defense to this argument, and especially a lot of the impact scenarios. But I do think that a lot of the impacts about piracy generally destabilizing the region and causing like trade disruptions are true. And so I'd say on this argument, just generally like it's pretty intuitive that if there are trade disruptions from pirates, like it's going to be bad for the economy. The one thing I would say is be careful what link evidence you use if you're reading this argument, because like what actor is actually going to like give the funds to deter piracy and build this infrastructure? And I think that's a question that's really important to answer if this argument is being read.
Okay. I think the next one is terrorism, right? Okay, yeah, cool. I can take this one. Okay, so terrorism is kind of similar to the piracy argument, but it's just kind of a shift in the actors. So rather than like Somali pirates off in like the Red Sea, this one's more specific to the two largest terrorist groups in the organization, Al-Shabaab, which is heavily affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and then the Houthi rebels, which are a rebel force in Yemen, which is like right across the Red Sea. And so, similar to the piracy link, it's just saying that by allowing the Somaliland to be recognized, it allows Somaliland to cooperate and like get military aid from places like the U.S., which would allow it to effectively combat terrorism. Um, and then, like Maeve was saying before, like this can get blown up very quickly, especially with rebel groups like the Houthis, which are currently in like firing back and forth with Israel, and there's escalation that can happen there. I think this is a slightly better version of the piracy argument. I think one, it allows for escalation that's more intuitive because I think it's hard to explain why random pirate attacks would escalate in the Red Sea as opposed to like organized terror attacks that are happening, especially in like the Levant. I think that is a much easier internal link scenario to make. And then also, I think the uniqueness on this argument is better than piracy because I think, but like I said before, like because of like the Houthis' relationship with Israel and how that is escalating right now, I think it lends itself to an easier uniqueness debate. Um, and I think also the Ackner analysis is better. I think it's better to explain why the U.S. would be more likely to give aid to combat terrorism um, than it would be to like explain like how the U.S. even combats piracy.
Okay. The next slide is on regional stability. So this argument is like kind of similar to like the other arguments like terror, piracy, and like even econ development. So the main uniqueness is that like Somaliland is like on the verge of like state collapse, and that the region itself is like suffering from like broader instability from varying actors like pirates or like Al-Shabaab or like other terrorist groups, stuff like that. And the solvency is that like affirming would allow for like recognition, which opens up the door for like more resources and aid, as well as like investment and like support from external countries and external actors. And that enhances like development, econ growth, and then counter-terror operations within Somaliland. And then the impact is that like state collapse is bad, and that it could like increases like poverty, stuff like that. And so it's like pretty like intuitive. And it's also like similar to like other arguments, like I said.
Okay, cool. And then the next argument is democracy. So this argument I feel is a little iffy. Not because it's not true, but because people are very much exaggerating how democratic Somaliland is. But right now, Somaliland is apparently a great democracy in the status quo, but is fragile due to both instability within the region and external pressure. And so that's basically the argument people will make is that right now, democracy is there, but it's fragile, which I think is true. And then the link to this argument is that affirming allows for recognition of a democratic state. And essentially, by becoming independent and being like a full democratic state that allows for A, more US and like more support in the region, just because people always read like the argument that, oh, democratic actors are going to come in and then there's going to be more democracy spillover in the region, which deters actors like China. You'll probably hear about that argument in a second, but generally, this argument just argues, hey, when we let them be in the AU, they have a full democratic state, which increases democracy in the region. It's pretty simple, I think, but the impacts that people read are first that this further solidifies and supports democratic government, stabilizing democracy in the region, which could be a good thing. You can also make arguments for democracy bad. People do that a lot, but I would say, someone is like laughing at me right now, but I would say specifically like stabilizing democracy in the region could spill over. A lot of people will tell you that it would spill over to other countries, which would be so, so awesome because then everyone would be democratic and happy and we'd all hold hands. And then the second impact people read is this could be a democratic influence within the region, helping model, and yeah, which is essentially just what I said. So it's just that, like, generally having a democracy in the region is good for modeling purposes and also just stability. So,
Cool. I can do the China one. Okay, so along with the aid or like general like aid arguments of like FDI and like IMF loans, this is probably the like an app that you're going to be seeing every round. It's like in a lot of cases, it's literally like aid then China. So the China argument is essentially saying right now, China is heavily invested in the eastern Horn of Africa, and a lot of cases will have evidence talking about like why it's super strategically important is like a linchpin of their broader strategy for hegemony. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, the like we were saying before with general background information, Somaliland overlooks a portion of the Red Sea called the Gulf of Aden, which like I think it's like 20% of global trade goes through. I think it's also that like the high speed internet cables that connect Asia to Africa go through this area of the Red Sea, all of which are like very close to Somaliland. And so this argument is essentially saying that by recognizing Somaliland, it allows the U.S. to be have a better foothold in the region, which allows better countering China efforts. So, just like some general overview on this argument is right now the place where like both the US and China are have military presence is in Djibouti. So it's right on the coast. The US is actually the only permanent base in the entirety of Africa is this base called Camp Leomir. And China recently built a base which is like 20 miles away. And China is also funding port projects in Djibouti. And so there's a lot of evidence out there saying like China is essentially elbowing the US out of the region. And so the link is that by allowing the U.S. to recognize, allowing Somaliland to be recognized, would allow the U.S. to put military bases there, which allows better counter China efforts because we're not being elbowed out of the region simultaneously. And so, exactly like combat China's hegemony, usually the link you'll see here, or like the internal link at least, is either one, preventing Chinese spread of authoritarianism, or second of all, you'll see things called like transition wars. And so like the uniqueness for this debate will be like China is going to overtake the United States as the global hegemon. And the China overtaking the US as the global hegemon would lead to war. And I think the internal link for this is that the US lashes out against China. And so by allowing the US to remain as the supreme like hegemon, you avoid that transition war. So this is probably the first or second most popular argument on this topic.
All right, the next, oh,
Oh,
Steven, I think you skipped one slide.
okay, go back one.
All right, yeah. So then this argument is about like food aid, and it's like low key like my favorite argument on the AF. So the uniqueness is that like Somaliland can't produce enough food because it's like experiencing like going through this like famine and that drought, and so it's like desperate need of aid, but it can't get that aid because of a lack of recognition. So you're going to start to see like this pattern where like a lot of these arguments are like dependent on like Somaliland either getting access to like support from other countries or like getting loans or like aid from other countries. So the link evidence is that like Somaliland will be able to like gain access to aid and like investments after you affirm, which is like vital to like help grow its like infrastructure and fight like food insecurity. And then the internal link is that food aid is key to combating like famine and like food insecurity. That's like pretty common throughout like the country. And then the impact is that like food insecurity increases your chances of dying. A couple of teams are also running like this like kind of like extra internal link, I guess, that's saying that like affirming also increases funding for like climate adaptation, which also solves for like the root cause of food insecurity and famine. So I don't know if there'll be another slide of for like climate adaptation, but the argument is that like even though the Horn of Africa doesn't contribute much to like greenhouse gas emissions globally, it's like an epicenter for like climate change. And and like the recent famine and like drought like are evidence of that. So once you affirm and like increase like the amount of aid that flows to Somaliland, it'll be like more equipped to like adapt and like handle climate change better, which is like crucial to like save lives.
Okay, cool. Next slide. Okay. So the next argument surrounds the Red Sea, and the uniqueness right now is that the Red Sea is spiraling, Houthis are out of control, and US weakness emboldens the Houthis. So right now, like Salman mentioned earlier, the Houthis are launching attacks against Israel. And so, like I'm sure a lot of people know, the US is one of Israel's like strongest allies. And also like right now, this whole argument is just saying like the Houthis are being emboldened because the US is showing weakness. And so a lot of the uniqueness will surround how like Trump will cut off arms and like just all these arguments. I'm sure there's like some specific link to it, but it's just art generally that the US is becoming weaker and that's emboldening the Houthis and they're looking for places to attack. And the uniqueness also states that the Red Sea is one of the targets because A, the Houthis are already there, and then B, like we said, there's a lot of instability. And so we're talking about like piracy and general just like trade conflict. And then the link on this argument is that recognition allows the US to expand its bases into Somaliland, reinforcing counter Houthi capabilities. And so the argument's kind of, I think it's a little more about power projection than it is about like actually having bases and like counter Houthi capabilities, because in reality, the US only really has like one base in the region. And so it's more about like US presence as opposed to like actual military fighting, because just generally it's like this idea of like deterring who the attacks in the future. But the impact, as most could have guessed, is probably just like that like who these escalate and that leads to nuclear war. And so the argument's essentially just that when it's recognized, that allows the United States to come in because they're allies with Somaliland. That establishes their presence in the region, both militarily and just as like a force, I guess. And then that deters Houthis, which right now are on the course to cause nuclear war and extinction.
Cool. Oh, quickly on this one as well. There's another internal link that a lot of people are also reading, which is like cable cutting. I think like it was like the Houthis like a couple months ago cut like three cables in the Red Sea. And so like a lot of people are reading like grid collapse internal link, which is like Houthis will cut cables that leads to global grid collapse, which causes extinction. That's just like another internal link that you should be out on the look for. Cool. So now we can talk about some con arguments. The first one is secession. This is probably one of, if not the most popular con argument on this topic. So it's saying right now Africa is like getting better. It's getting more stable. Like a bunch of civil wars have now ended or are cooling down, and right now is a like time for Africa to start rebuilding and increasing in stability. The link is that by recognizing Somaliland, the African Union betrays, like Maeve said, one of the core foundations, which is recognition of colonial borders. And so what that does is like there's like a bunch of nuances you can add into the link scenario here. The basic link is that it emboldens other secessionist movements throughout the Horn of Africa. And that just means that like recognizing Somaliland means that other secessionist movements start to gain momentum, and that leads to instability. So a couple like nuances you'll see is like you'll sometimes people will be mentioning like who's funding secessionist movements. There's also nuances as to like why Somaliland is uniquely different than other places. So like just be on the look for there's a bunch of like random cards that well not random like a bunch of different cards people will put into these link scenarios. So just be on the lookout for that. Um, yeah, and it's just like increasing civil war will kill a lot of people, and yeah, so just like emboldening secession movements is pretty bad.
One thing I want to add is that you have to kind of be like careful of how you run secession because there's a lot of like evidence saying that like in the past, whenever countries seceded, we didn't see like I guess like the secession spillover. So I feel like it would be more persuasive to the judge that if you ran it as like Somaliland sets a precedent for like secession movements within the region of Horn of Africa rather than the continent of Africa as a whole, because it's pretty unlikely that like Somaliland recognition will like impact like secession movements in like South Africa or like Nigeria. But on to the next kind of argument, which is terrorism. So it's kind of like the opposite of like the AF. So, on the AF, the uniqueness, I guess, is that like terror is increasing, but on the neg, you're arguing that terror is like, I guess, on the de decline. And there's also like evidence saying that like Ethiopia has like recently like stationed like troops within Somalia, which is like contributing to like counter terror. The main like terrorist organization that will like come up on this argument is like Al-Shabaab, which is like part of a branch of like Al-Qaeda. And so the link is that like once you recognize Somaliland, it forces Somalia to like I guess like expel Ethiopian troops off its soil, and that like leads to a stronger Al-Shabaab. People are also running like this link that says that like affirming like enrages Al-Shabaab because like it kills any chance of like one Somalia because like Al-Shabaab is like kind of like dedicated to like this like one Somali state. And then the internal link is that an enraged and like more powerful Al-Shabaab like leads to like more instability within the Horn of Africa and that like spirals out to nuclear war. The main like I guess like internal link to nuclear war is that like a great power drawn. That's how a lot of like teams are reading like I guess like this like act or like internal link into nuclear war. It's that like whenever there's like instability or like this big conflict in Africa, great powers draw in, especially in the Horn of Africa because it's kind of like a powder keg.
Okay, yeah. The next argument is Somali invasion. And so the argument is essentially just that Somalia is highly unlikely to go to war without aggravation. And then the link is that a recognition of Somaliland would inherently infringe on Somalia's sovereignty, causing conflict due to violation of sovereignty and territory. And the impact is that this would generally cause a war, which will kill thousands. I think this is one of the weaker arguments on the affirmative, simply because right now, like we've said, Somaliland practically does function as an independent state with their own economy and such and their own culture. And we haven't really seen Somalia. We've seen them kind of be a little more peaceful in the past few years, especially with like the stuff with Ethiopia. And so, especially with this argument, I think what's really key is to like win the uniqueness that Somalia will go to war if they lose the legal right over here. Oh yeah, Nirmal, whoops. Oh, never mind. But essentially, the argument's just that Somalia values their sovereignty and having legal rights over Somaliland. And so when Somaliland becomes sovereign and essentially an independent state because they have diplomatic recognition, they lose that right and Somalia gets mad and invades. I also think like the best response to this argument is just that Somalia has a weak economy and can't do that. But, you know, why do they support that? Oh, I can answer the question in chat. So Somalia and Somaliland used to be one. They were just Somalia, and then the Assault Clan in 1961, after Somalia earned independence from Britain, the Assault Clan in 1991. Yeah, we got this right earlier, but they declared independence for Somaliland. And so they used to be one big state, but then Somaliland became a de facto state and broke off from Somalia, but they are still legally under their control. And so the reason like certain groups support one Somali unity is because like they see it as like just an extension of their territory.
Cool. Um, yes, stability. So, um, the stability agreement has a lot to do with like a lot of regional tensions that have flared up. So, just like some background information, um, I it might have been like yeah, sometime during last year, I forget the month, Ethiopia issued something called an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding. And so what this said is that like sometime in the future they might recognize Somaliland, and then in return they got to like build a port in Somaliland. I think it was like the port of Berbera, and like Normal was talking about. And so Ethiopia also has so this flared up a bunch of regional tensions. One, it flared up tensions between Somalia and Ethiopia because like Somalia sees like Somaliland as a part of their territory, so they didn't like that Ethiopia was engaging with them. Two, it flared up tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia. So just generally, like Egypt has been more backing of Somalia, and a lot of the tensions between Ethiopia and Egypt had to do with them being like the two biggest powers in the region. And then also it's because the Ethiopia has like been using part of the Nile, which Egypt doesn't like because I think it's been like polluting waters or something. Not like 100% set on that, but I'm pretty sure it's like they've been using the Nile and Egypt doesn't like it. And so what this is saying is that by recognizing Somaliland, it would flare up regional tensions again, and a bunch of relations would start to break down. And it says like again, like in the impact, it would generate conflict. Another nuance people add in is that like because the African Union's credibility is founded on like recognition of colonial borders, the breakdown of that precedent would lead to like the African Union not being able to even intervene in any of these conflicts. And so like you get like the double whammy of like people one like starting conflict with one another because tensions are up, and then also the largest regional organization isn't able to do anything about it. Cool.
All right, so this slide is like this argument is like kind of like more specific to Al-Shabaab, which is like the main terror group within Somaliland and within the Horn of Africa. Right now, I'm pretty sure that Al-Shabaab like pretty much only operates in Somalia, but they're looking to expand. So the uniqueness argument is that like Al-Shabaab is like a huge threat in the region and like seeks to like further their like power, and they're looking to like expand past Somalia. And the link is that like recognition causes the Somali government to like lose legitimacy, and then the internal link is that like the Al-Shabaab takes up like their opportunity to like strike and take advantage of like a weak and illegitimate Somali government. And then the impact is that like emboldenment would lead to like regional conflict and terror. I personally think this is like a less common and also like a less persuasive um like terror argument. I kind of like the previous terror argument that kind of like um goes along the lines that like Somalia is like kind of mad about like recognition, and so they expel Ethiopian troops off their soil in protest, which is like crucial to like fight back Al-Shabaab. I also like the idea that like Al-Shabaab is like committed to like this like sole Islamic state in Horn of Africa, and that affirming would kind of like ruin their like goal or like dream, and that would lead to their emboldenment, which would cause them to like escalate in the region.
Okay. And the next argument is, oh,
Oh,
go
sorry.
back. The next argument's border tribes.
Best argument. Best
I
argument.
think this is the best argument on the topic,
I'm
for no
not
particular reason.
biased.
But I think, okay, so essentially, right now, the Assault Clan, even though they are the group that primarily runs Somaliland, they're not the only group in the region. There are a ton of diverse and interesting like clans who live really near the Somaliland-Somalia border in this region that's called Puntland. And so if you look at the map, yeah, you can actually see it right here. You can see how Somaliland has all these different regions, but then you see Puntland, and Puntland is essentially composed. It's also kind of a Somali breakoff state, but like not really because it's still a part of Somalia. And so it's really interesting, actually. I would recommend looking into like different clans in the like region and how they function. But essentially, Puntland and specifically on the border, are a lot of tribes. But the link from the negative is that when recognition happens and when they get recognition, they start attacking these tribes to secure their border. And I think the link evidence on this topic is like specifically persuasive because in 2022, the US released this like document about what they would do if Somaliland gained independence. And a lot of it involved militarizing the police, which would allow them to continue perpetuating this violence against the tribes on the border. So Somaliland in the past has displaced people on the border and been horrible to these tribes because, like we've said, the Asak is a majority in Somaliland, and there's just a ton of these minority tribes who live along the region that they're trying to secure. And so when they get this military from the United States, that allows them to carry out this violence. And so there's two links on this. The first is that A, the US would recognize Somaliland. If you're reading this, you have to win that when the AU grants diplomatic recognition, the US would also think that's legitimate. And then the second is that the US would give military capabilities to Somaliland to forcefully gain control. And so the argument's just that Somaliland wants control of their border. They will use any means it takes to like have that control. And the US has justified this in the past and said like they would give them this military. And so I think this is why it's probably one of the stronger arguments. But there's a bunch of impacts to this. I would say specifically looking into it, a majority of them are just generally displacement impacts because like when you militarize the border and you force people to leave their homes and abandon like their culture and their land, that's just kind of there are so many impacts you can read off of that. And so yeah, that's border tribes. I think it's Salman, do you have anything to add or
Oh, yeah. So like just some like general terminology. So like if someone reads this argument, you're not lost because a lot of time people will like be reading like specific names of tribes and stuff. So the tribe that people talk about when they talk about people getting displaced is this tribe called the Dolbahante. This is in that like green region on the map called Sul. So like some general like background information about like conflict in the past. So in 2023, there's huge flares of violence in this town, in this not town, city called Lasanad, which is like a major town in South Somaliland. And so there's like a full-fledged resistant movement that happened, and it got like put down pretty violently. Like I think like hospitals were shot up and like a lot of people were forced to move. And so one of the main like beyond Somaliland itself being strategically vital for a lot of countries, it like the area of Sulu itself, like I think like recently discovered that it had oil, which like the US loves. And so the US like that's another incentive for the US like specifically give military aid for this reason specifically. Um oh yeah, and then like Maeve was saying um in the chat, this argument goes very well with framing. Like we read this argument like every single round at Blake. And like all except for like one round, we read it with framing that like talked about like why it's good to focus on issues of small scale violence. So like this argument definitely needs framing, especially in like tech debates where you're going up against like three different nuke war scenarios. So like generally the strategy for this should be like just frame your opponent out of the debate. You shouldn't like we went for framing as like independent offense in some rounds. So like with this argument, like get to know your framing. Find like a specific argument of framing you like, whether that just be like structural violence generally or something more specific. You can even use it as like a launching pad for like different K-lit. So just like if you're reading this argument, get to know your framing, and like get super comfortable with it.
One thing I like to add on this argument is that like one of the most common responses if you're reading this is like the synonym that like conflict is like already happening. And so like AF kind of does nothing. I feel like a good way to like frontline that or refute that is like the fact that like Somaliland just had a new president who's like more committed to like peace among and like more I guess like more I guess like more peace between like all the tribes within Somaliland. And so like abruptly like affirming and like giving recognition to Somaliland would like kind of like end all of his promises, which would like prompt like um people fleeing violence from like all these clans fighting against each other.
Oh, oh, yo, any questions?
Yeah, you can just put them in the chat if you have
Yeah,
any
you can put yeah.
about like literally any argument.
You guys should talk more about sheer framing that you guys ran at Blake.
Oh,
Oh,
sure.
Q&A. So the framing we read at Blake, it was essentially just we read this evidence called the Kerr. And essentially what we argued was that people should look more at small scale instances of violence because talking so much about like nuclear war and extinction desensitizes us to these issues. And so it's really hard to like understand what's happening in Africa specifically and in the Horn of Africa if we are so focused on like these huge United States great power war type of conversations. And so essentially, what we argued was that if teams do not focus on Africa and they don't, how we phrased this was deprovincialize Africa, which means to center Africa as a unit of study. It's a very specific term where you look at issues in Africa not through the lens of like Western countries and how it would impact them, like the US or China, but well, China's not Western, but big countries. And you instead look at small scale impacts. And so a lot of our argument was this is an issue people pointed out. We didn't really have a bright line for what small scale impact was. We're adding one.
Coming up with one for Emery though, guys.
Get
Watch
ready.
out.
Get ready,
Watch
everyone.
out.
But essentially just focusing on like impacts like displacement or like violence against women are generally just what we were saying you should do. And if you don't do that, that's a reason you should lose. And so that's what we were reading, basically. And now we can return to the chat
Oh
where
yeah, there are some questions.
there's some questions.
On the one about like how the AF would refute, I thought like the most compelling response I heard was like Somaliland's new president, kind of like in the opposite direction of what Nirmal was talking about. It's like Somaliland's new president is committed to like peace with tribes, and so like even if the old president, I don't know like to what extent this is true because I was like this happened in our like this happened in our like doubles round, so like I didn't really do much research after it, but just from like what they were saying is like Somaliland's new president is committed to peace, and so like even if he got U.S. military aid, he wouldn't necessarily feel compelled to like crack down on border tribes. And so like that would be good, and not be good, but like wouldn't cause the extent of violence that we talk about in case. Um. Cool. Wait.
I
Okay.
On
think
Restate the board. Oh, you go.
All right, I think Gabby wants you guys to like restate this like framing for like border tribes.
Mhm.
Yeah. If you wanna.
Oh, yeah. Um, so it was essentially just you have to focus on small scale impacts and center Africa as opposed to Western countries. And so and what would we recommend as a second structural violence contention? I know we read instability in the region because we were reading impacts as to like how on our border tribes contention, we read specific ones to like farming. We read farming impacts because there are a lot of communities who are pastoral in these tribes, like the Dolbahante clan specifically heavily relies on like pastoral lands and like farming the land. And so displacing them is really, really bad because then they don't have any food or livelihood. But the second contention we would go for would be general instability and just like violence in the region and displacement otherwise.
Yeah. Um, so like if you want to like look more into the framing, we read like the most framing cards we read were like during the first couple rounds at the round robin. That has essentially like every framing card we cut, except for like a couple which weren't really that great. So like if you're interested in like the framing more like the more like high theory stuff in the framing, look through like the first couple rounds of the Blake round robin. So like going over like that version of the framing, it was like one big thing we talked about at the beginning was this term called like historicism, which is like when you don't center like the global south and you rather like focus on like impacts like nuclear war, you're essentially squishing the entire history of the global south into like blips in like western history. So like in this term, like and like the for example, like in the Somaliland topic, if you only care about nuclear war, you only care about people in Africa insofar as how they relate to the West and how they relate to America. And so like the cards talk about how like this is problematic and racist because it just like views like black and brown people as just like little side like little footnotes in like a larger white history. I think we disclosed rebuttal evidence, right?
Yeah, we disclosed rebuttal evidence.
Okay. So another argument we were reading that had to do with framing is this like you are racist turn that we read at the top of rebuttals. Joshua and Eva didn't like it, but it's essentially saying like extinction impacts and like large scale instances of violence are and like focusing on those is racist because they like the idea of like a magnitude of debate is essentially like saying like who is going to die and like whose lives are worth saving. I think the articulation of this argument is a little better in the tag than what I'm saying now because I'm a little sleepy. So like look through that stuff. If you're interested in reading it, like shoot us an email. We'd be totally happy to help.
Someone had a question about like why Somalia would push Ethiopian troops out of their country if that would like kind of like threaten their government. So that I guess would be like a pretty good response if you're on the app and you're responding it to it on like if to like a neg argument. But I feel like the main reason for like why Somalia would do that is because like mainly out of protest, like Ethiopia is a pretty big like ally and supporter of Somaliland, which Somalia doesn't like. So there could be a couple reasons as to why Somalia would do that. The first is like, I guess, decrease its dependence on like a country like Ethiopia who like goes against their own like national like ideologies and beliefs. And then another one would be to like realign itself with like other countries within the Horn of Africa to like increase its own geopolitical leverage. So like the way I ran it at Blake was that like a reason why Somalia would like expel Ethiopian troops was so it could like become allies with countries like Kenya and Djibouti to like increase its own geopolitical leverage in the Horn of Africa and counter Ethiopia's growing influence in the region. If that makes sense. There's all obviously like other ways you can argue that though.
Um, then we have any other questions? Like if we
I
didn't
think
answer it, like put it again in the chat.
I think Macy has a question. So I think they're saying like they're what do you mean by like Somaliland's current functional independence? Like Simon, maybe you know what Macy's like talking about?
Uh, I don't really.
I think I get it.
Oh yeah.
Um, I mean, like, I think one of the main things that people will say against this on the affirmative is that even if they're functionally independent, there's so many barriers. And so, like, what a lot of these arguments were talking about was even though they do function independently as an economy, they can't get foreign direct investment or have IMF loans or be a part of the World Bank because they are not actually independent legally and they don't have sovereignty from Somalia. And so I would say specifically on the AF, um, to argue against that, because essentially you're just asserting like kind of a claim about how it is right now. I think like I would recommend definitely adding a little bit more of an impact or like a scenario that would happen. But also, I think like that's not a reason that it should be independent is the main thing I'd say about that is like even though they are functionally independent right now, I feel like you should maybe gear your argument more towards like why the AU recognizing them would help them. And so like whether that's economically, through foreign direct investment, through food aid, or something else that they cannot access right now because they are not actually independent. Did that make sense? Was that like answering the question? I don't know. Somaliland is acting as its own state.
Oh, cool.
Okay, okay, cool. Does anyone?
Um, oh yeah, I think Lila had a question about like since like Somalia is a recognized country and it's not receiving aid to combat terrorism, uh what's the guarantee that Somaliland will as well? I feel like uh common front line to that would probably be that like Somaliland is like more strategic in the fact that it's like on the Gulf of Aden and like on the Red Sea, which like Somalia kind of doesn't border, and that so like it's more open to like investments and to foreign aid. Um, I think that would be a common front line. But that's an interesting like response. Like I've never heard of that or like thought of that even.
Yeah. Oh, just to answer Alexa's question, like I don't think that any of yeah. So like all of these arguments and stuff were just like general arguments we hit throughout Blake. Like so like if you just look on the wiki and like look for like typed in to the search bar any of these arguments, you'd probably find a bunch of people who read them and then be able to see the cases. Um why isn't okay, cool. So just for like why isn't Somalia receiving aid? So like Somalia itself is receiving aid, but but because Somaliland is a de facto state and they like function independently, Somaliland itself doesn't end up getting like any, if not like much, if not any of that aid. And so it's like Somaliland gaining recognition would allow it to gain access to aid, whereas it's not really getting any right now.
Yeah, another reason why Somalia isn't, I guess, like receiving that much aid compared to like what Somaliland might if it's recognized is because of like the widespread corruption within its government and like the presence of Al-Shabaab. There's like a lot of literature out there saying that like um Somalia's like aid agencies are actually like, corrupt, and a lot of the aid that's actually going to Somalia gets diverted to like corrupt politicians or like even terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab. So that could be a reason why Somalia isn't receiving that much aid now. But I think like a common argument is that um most of Somaliland's aid is actually going to Somalia, to like Somalia's capital, and then it's getting like redirected from there to Somaliland. So rather than having aid go to Somalia first and then Somaliland, it's better to just have uh like to recognize Somaliland so it can have its like own like aid to deal with.
Okay, I
Um
can answer Zachary's question. So like the question of like why the U.S. recognized Somaliland. So like the main reason why the U.S. is like it's probably most likely geopolitical. It's like the Somaliland sits along one of the most major trade corridors, and it would allow the U.S. to gain better leverage against China, who's heavily invested in the region. Like remember that like the argument we talked about before about like the U.S. being able to counter China. So like the U.S. being able to have a better foothold in Eastern Africa and Africa in general would provide the incentive. Just like a general caution out to any of you who want to like make an argument that the U.S. would recognize Somaliland. Like, do not. There's this evidence written by this guy named Rubin. Do not read the Rubin evidence. He is like really, really, really racist, and we almost lost to an IVI at Blake because we did not know. And so like do not just find a better piece of evidence. It's like we have it on our wiki from like the later portions of the Blake tournament. Like, just don't read the Rubin evidence if you're trying to make the argument that the U.S. would recognize Somaliland. So does anyone want to take the question about the AU?
Sure. So one, I guess, benefit or like one reason, I guess like one way that like AU probably wouldn't benefit is that like it would kill its own legitimacy. So on the neg, like the it's like a pretty common argument actually. So the way people are running it is that like the AU kind of like supports like colonial borders and like suddenly like affirming and like stepping away from that ideology would like kind of like ruin its legitimacy, and that could like I guess increase secession movements across like Africa and like increase the likelihood of conflict on the continent. A benefit of the of could be okay, so there's like this like argument that like Eastridge ran that I hit at Blake. It was like this like weird argument that like right now, like Ethiopia is on track to recognize Somaliland, and other countries would also follow Ethiopia. And if that happens, countries would like, because like AU is against Somaliland recognition, countries would like opt out of the AU to recognize Somaliland, which would like decrease AU's legitimacy. I don't think that argument is like that convincing. Um, I know that they didn't go for it when they ran it against us, but um, I feel like the A legitimacy argument on the neg would be more common and more convincing. That like it would lose legitimacy if it were to recognize Somaliland.
Okay, cool. Are there any final questions? Okay, I'm gonna take that as a no, but if one comes in like the next 10 seconds, then we'll be good. Great lecture. Oh, thank
Okay,
you.
like, thank you.
Oh, wait, Steven. Steven says we should take a photo.
Oh, okay.
Everyone do a thumbs up. If
Everyone,
you're
yeah.
comfortable and you want to turn on your camera for the Empower Debate Instagram, um,
Yes.
that would be very appreciated.
We should probably end the record. Yeah, end the screen share.
Yeah,
Okay.
cool. So
Thumbs up.
thumbs up, everyone. Yeah, Steven, you better be in
Yes,
this.
Steven.
Steven, are you trying to do like a timer photo? I saw
I
like,
can't do that on my computer.
oh, unfortunate,
Okay, okay,
unfortunate.
I got it.
Yeah.
That's all one you got
All
it.
right.
Okay, okay,
Thumbs up.
okay.
Are we still
Yay.
supposed to? Okay.
How'd
Yeah,
y'all
yeah,
feel
thumbs
about
up.
this?
Okay, thumbs up. Wait, yo.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Ready? 3, 2, 1. We got it.
Good job, Salman.
Ooh, if not, we can take a screen grab from the recording.
Yeah, true, true, true.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Have a great night, everyone.
Have a great night, everyone. Happy back to school.
Yeah.
Happy is a strong
Thanks for
word.
joining.